want to continue looking at the doctrine of God. We begin today with the attributes of God. We've looked at the the being and nature of God. In that were some of the attributes, such as His eternity, His self-existence, His sovereignty. Those are all technically attributes of God. In Hosea 11 and verse 9, we hear the Lord say, "For I am God and not man." And the attributes, that's what they declare. They declare that God is God. God is not man. When we speak about the attributes, they declare that God is unique. God is uniquely God. And again, we have to be careful that you do not compare God to earthly things, because you'll always make Him smaller than He is. In Isaiah chapter 40, again, He is uniquely God, and He declares such. Isaiah 40, verse 18, "To whom then will ye liken God? What likeness will you compare unto Him?" He's uniquely God. Notice in verse 25, "To whom then will ye liken me? Or shall I be equal, saith the Holy One?" And then Isaiah 46 and verse 5, "To whom will you liken me, and make me equal, and compare me, that we may be like?" Again, in each one of those verses, God is declaring Himself to be unique, beyond compare. Nothing that you can compare Him to. So, what is an attribute? An attribute, of course, is a quality or a characteristic ascribed to someone or something. So when we're talking about the attributes of God, we're talking about qualities of God. We're talking about characteristics of the Lord. Now, when we talk about the attributes of God, they are distinguishable characteristics that are attributed to God, that are absolutely inseparable from God. If you remove these attributes, God is not God. So they are inseparable from the Lord. They are the fundamental qualities of His being. They are inherent to Him. They're basically who He is. They're what He is. The attributes declare who He is. They declare what He is. Very characteristics of His nature. It's what makes up the nature of God. So the attributes of God are what God tells us about Himself in His Word. They're not things that we attribute to God. They are the characteristics that God reveals to us of Himself through His Word. In other words, they are descriptions of God. Again, telling us what God is like, the attributes of God. a danger when considering the attributes of God, many people tend to look at the attributes as components of the Lord. But the attributes are not mere components of God. They are descriptive of His nature, of His character, of His personage, of His being, of His essence. Again, they declare who He is. And God is unique, and the attributes of God really declare His uniqueness. You can't compare the attributes of God with the attributes, the characteristics of man. Another thing we have to remember is God is always more than His attributes. In other words, the attributes cannot fully describe God. God is more than His attributes. An attribute of God is His omnipotence. He's almighty. But God's more than almighty. I mean, almighty doesn't do justice to who He is. So God is more than His attributes, and that's why we stressed God cannot be fully described. God cannot be fully defined. God cannot be fully grasped. He's bigger than that. He's more than that. Whatever understanding we have of God, He's more than that. No matter whoever on the earth has the most understanding of who God is, He's much more than that. You haven't even begun to scratch the surface. Again, we've looked at this verse several times, the book of Job, chapter 11. But this is a truth we have to keep in mind as we look at the attributes. God is more than His attributes. In Job chapter 11, verse 7 through verse 9, canst thou by searching find out God? Okay, one way we study God is you can't study God without studying His attributes, His characteristics. But even if you could fully understand the attributes of God, we can't. But even if you could, again, God is more. God is more. Canst thou find out the Almighty unto perfection? It is as high as heaven, what canst thou do? Deeper than hell, what canst thou know? The measure thereof is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. So if we could make a complete list of the attributes of God, we still have not fully described God. In other words, a list does not fully describe God. Any list, no matter how comprehensive that list is, falls short of capturing who He is in His entirety. Again, we can have a true knowledge of God, but we cannot have an exhaustive knowledge of God. We cannot have a complete knowledge of God because He's infinite. He's bigger than our minds can conceive. So we need to keep in mind that the attributes of God, God's bigger than the attributes, more than the attributes. Have to keep in mind that when we talk about attributes, this is not what man attributes to God, but it is what God reveals to man concerning Himself. So the attributes of God would be the perfections. That's all God has is perfections. There are no imperfections. It would be the perfections of God revealed in His Word that describe his being, the essential characteristics that reveal who and what God is. So the attributes of God answers the questions, who is God? Doesn't completely answer it, but it answers that question, who is God? It answers the question, what is God like? What is God like? Well, if you were to go around the room and ask people, what is God like? You can't answer that question without using the attributes. Some of the attributes of God. Someone might say, well, God is love. True. And love is what? An attribute of God. They might say, well, God knows everything. True. That's the omniscience of God. That's an attribute of you. You can't describe God without using the attributes. So the attributes basically give us an outline and a profile of God. So we need to study the attributes. We need to know the attributes. The attributes of God are the glory of God. The glory of God is who God is. That's his glory. When God reveals himself, some part of himself, that's the glory of God. So the two cannot be separated. The glory of God, the attributes of God. Notice in Psalm 104, Psalm 104, and verse 31, God's glory is eternal. Now, eternity is an attribute of God, but God's glory is eternal. Verse 31, the glory of the Lord shall endure forever. The glory of the Lord, because the glory of God is who he is. That shall endure forever. The glory of the Lord is great. Notice in Psalm 138, Psalm 138 and verse 5. The last part of that verse says, for great is the glory of the Lord. It's who he is. It's his attributes. Ephesians 3, verse 16, we see that God's glory abounds with richness. It's rich, more than you and I can comprehend. So the Hebrew word for glory is kabod, and it means a weight, something that you can feel, something that radiates and leaves an impression upon an individual. The New Testament word is doxa, and it means beauty or magnificence. So you put the two together, and you have the weight of the beauty and magnificence of the Lord. That's the glory of God, the weight of the beauty and magnificence of God. What is the beauty and magnificence of God? Well, it's his attributes. And his attributes is his glory. So the glory of God is something, when God manifests his glory, it is something that we can see. It is something that we can feel. And we see it and feel it in such a way that it leaves an impression upon us, a lasting impression. So it's God's moral beauty. It's his perfection of character, the glory of God. Again, it's the attributes of God. In Isaiah 35, and verse 2. the last part of the verse, we see the glory of the Lord and the excellency of our God. The glory of God is the shining forth of the excellency of God. How do we know the excellency of God? That's the attributes of God. It's what makes up the nature of God. And the glory of God is manifested through all of his attributes. In Exodus 33 and verse 18, Moses asked God, he said, show me, that is, exhibit to me, reveal to me, cause me to see and know. Show me thy glory. That's a request of Moses. Show me thy glory. He's asking God to reveal himself to Moses. He's pleading for God to make manifest himself. In response to that request, show me thy glory, God, what did God do? God would reveal attributes of himself. That's the glory of God. Notice in Exodus 33, verse 19. Again, verse 18, I beseech thee, show me thy glory. Verse 19, and he said, I will make all my goodness. Now that's an attribute of God, the goodness of God. I will make all my goodness pass before thee. I will proclaim the name of the Lord. The name of the Lord is everything God is before thee, and will be gracious. To whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy, and whom I will show mercy. So when Moses requested, show me thy glory, what did God do? He showed him his attributes. He showed him who he is. That is the glory of God. God revealed his goodness. He said, I will make all my goodness pass before thee. He revealed his name, representing all that he is, his absoluteness, if you will. He revealed his grace. He said, I will be gracious. He revealed his mercy. I will show mercy. He revealed his sovereignty. He said, I'll be gracious to whom I'll be gracious, and I'll show mercy to whom I'll show mercy. He revealed his sovereignty. So God's attributes equals God's glory. And God's glory equals God's attributes. So you cannot separate the two. Now, in order for Moses to see God, to see the glory of God, Moses needed to be shielded, because no man can see God and live, because it's too great. That's why we need glorified bodies in heaven. These bodies can't take that. In Ezekiel, or Exodus 33, verse 20, and he said, thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. It's too glorious. Verse 21, and the Lord said, behold, there is a place by me, and thou shalt stand upon a rock. And I believe the place is Jesus Christ. And it shall come to pass, while my glory passeth by, that I will put thee in a cleft of the rock, and will cover thee with my hand, or shield thee, while I pass by. And I will take away my hand, and thou shalt see my back parts, but my face shall not be seen. You could only see part of his glory. Only a part. And that's still so today. So no matter how much we know about God, we only know a small part. God, again, is more than his attributes. God is greater than his attributes. Now, on several occasions in the Bible, God revealed his glory. God showed his glory. We see it in the wilderness journeys. Exodus 16, Exodus 24, Exodus 40, all places where God revealed His glory. Children of Israel, when they crossed the Red Sea, it says they sang, and what did they sing about? They sang of His glorious power. His glorious power. Power is an attribute of God. Exodus 15:11, they said He was glorious in holiness. That is, they could feel the weight and the weight of the beauty and the magnificence of His holiness and His power. That's God's glory. The attributes of God. So God's glory has depths and has measures that go beyond human comprehension and goes beyond what man can receive. So, again, though they can be defined to a degree, you can only define the attributes of God to a degree. You can't completely define them. It can't be completely defined because it can't be completely understood. So, which shows, again, the greatness of God. You don't want a God that you can completely understand in our puny minds. That would be a small God. So, you cannot define the infinite. Can't be defined. And so it is with God. So when we consider the attributes of God, they have to be considered in light of His self-existence. Who and what God is, He is in and of Himself. That's what we mean by the self-existence of God. In other words, He is dependent upon nothing outside of Himself for who He is and what He is. That cannot be said of anything else. Can't be said of anything else. Everything else was dependent for their beginning upon God. And everything is dependent concerning their sustenance upon God. But God is who He is, what He is, in and of Himself, completely independent upon everything else. That's what we mean by the self-existence of God. So when we consider the attributes of God, they have to be considered in light of the self-existence of God. For example, if you're thinking about the power of God, you consider that God doesn't draw His power from us. God doesn't draw His power from anything outside of Himself. God is almighty. God is all-powerful. And He is so in and of Himself. That's what we mean by looking at the attributes in light of His self-existence. In other words, no one has bestowed any of these attributes upon God. People have attributes. They have characteristics. They have temperament. They have personality. Some of these things you're born with. Most of these things you are trained in. But God is. God is who He is, independent of all else. So, when we consider His attributes, we've already said His attributes are not just merely components of God. The tendency when someone studies the attributes is to look at, and we will, but to look at them as separate entities. And we're going to do that. But we have to realize that they're not separate entities. There's a unity about them. God is all-powerful. God has all power. He has all might. God also has all wisdom. And you better be thankful that the one who has all power has all wisdom in using that power. You don't want to put power in the hands of someone who isn't very wise. You don't want to do that. I mean, world leaders, we have that problem today. But God's all-powerful, and God exercises His power in His wisdom, and He exercises His power in His love, and on and on you can go. So there's separate entities as far as studying them goes, but they're not, in reality, they're not separate entities. There's a unity about them. So we have to keep that in mind as well. His holiness, His knowledge, His power, His love, all in unison to each other and who He is. God cannot deny Himself. Like Moses in Exodus 33:18, show me thy glory. And the psalmist, notice in Psalm 63, verses 1 and 2, O God, thou art my God. Early will I seek thee. My soul thirsteth for thee. My flesh longeth for thee in a dry and thirsty land where no water is, to see thy power. He wants the psalmist wants the same thing that Moses wanted. He wanted to see the glory of God, to see thy power and thy glory. So as I have seen thee in the sanctuary. So it should be the passion of every child of God to experience the glory of God, to experience the attributes of God. We read in Exodus 40, verse 34, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. That is, everywhere you turned in that tabernacle, you could feel the glory of God. You could feel the attributes of God. You could feel the person of God. You could feel who God is. And again, that's His glory. You could feel the perfection and the presence of God. His grace, His mercy, His sovereignty. And that should be the yearning of every child of God. To see, to feel the glory of the Lord. Therefore, we should study. We should seek to know, as much as we can know, the attributes of God. That's what we read in Job 22:21. Acquaint thyself now with the Lord. And we do that by, one of the ways we do that is by looking at the attributes of God. And we ought to look at the attributes of God. We ought to study the attributes of God for several reasons. One, because you and I are to increase in our knowledge of God. We are to increase in our knowledge in a relationship way, most certainly. But we're also to increase in just our knowledge of God, who He is. And you do that by studying the attributes of God, the characteristics of God. Notice in Colossians 1, you can look for the attributes of God in your life. You look at your life and you mark the places. Okay, that was God showing His mercy. That was God showing His grace. That was God manifesting His power. We see the attributes every day. But many times we're oblivious. In Colossians 1, verse 10, that you might walk worthy of the Lord unto all pleasing, being fruitful in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God. So we are to increase in our knowledge of God. We ought to want to know more about God. And the more we know about God, the more we want to know about God. We should never, ever be satisfied with whatever knowledge we have of God right now. We should not be satisfied with that because there's more to know. There's always more to know of God. So we ought to desire to study the attributes of God. Another reason to study the attributes of God, because a right conception of God is basic is foundational to sound theology. You cannot be sound theologically and be off on God. Can't happen. You look at the doctrine of salvation. There are two parties involved in salvation. God and man. Two parties. If you're wrong on one of those parties, that's only 50%. But the truth is, if you're wrong on one, you're wrong on the other as well. So it's important that yes, we can't know everything there is to know about God, but it's important that what we do know, that it's correct, that it's accurate. So a correct and accurate knowledge of God is critical to soundness in Bible doctrine. Also, because a right conception of God is critical to our faith. Faith must have an object. And the object of faith is God. Mark 11:22 says, "Have faith in God." Well, if you have an inaccurate knowledge of God, an incorrect knowledge of God, that's going to affect your faith. So we have to have a correct knowledge of God in order to encourage faith in God. Also, a right conception of God is critical to an accurate knowledge of ourselves. God is the standard of measure. It's not wise for man to compare himself with themselves, because that's an inaccurate standard of measurement. You compare yourself to God, and every single time you fall way, way, way short. So it gives us an accurate knowledge of ourselves. It gives us an accurate knowledge of who we are. Also, a right conception of God is critical to true worship. It's critical to worshiping the Lord. Notice in John chapter 4, this is the woman at the well with Jesus Christ. And in verse 22, he says, "Ye worship, ye know not what." That is, you go through the motions of worship, the formality of worship, but you don't know what you worship. In other words, you're ignorant of God. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is a spirit, so he begins to tell this woman who God is. Because if you're going to worship God, you got to know who God is. You got to know what you're worshiping. And they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. God is spirit, God is truth. And if you're going to worship God, you have to worship him in accordance with him, in spirit and in truth. Notice also in Acts 17. Acts 17, verse 23, Paul says, "For as I passed by and behold your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God," the God we don't know, "whom therefore ye ignorantly worship. Him declare I unto you." They needed to know God. God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven. That enhances worship. Knowing that he is the Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things. A correct knowledge of God is necessary to the elements of worship. The elements of worship are awe. You don't worship God unless you are in awe of God. So you have to know who he is. And then there's awe, and there's reverence, and there's amazement, and there's wonderment. All of those are critical to worship. And it's the knowledge of God that creates awe and reverence in these things. And then lastly, because a right conception of God provides the ultimate lens to view all things. We're to view all things through the lens of who God is, what God is. That gives us a more accurate view of what's going on, what's happening with our life, what's happening in society, what's happening in the world. You view it through the lens of who God is and what God is. It gives us a correct view of all things. So it's very important that we study the attributes of God. And next week we'll begin looking at these attributes, these characteristics of God. But again, as we do, just remember God is more than the attribute. He's more than that. He's more. Not one single attribute fully describes God. Let's look to the Word of Lord in the word of prayer. Heavenly Father, again, we thank you, Lord, for who you are. We thank you, Lord, for revealing your